The alphabet letter soup industries or companies such as the FBI, DHS, and many of the others are actively engaged in fraudulent schemes which engage in the undermining of their status quo objective in customs that subvert the objective, in customs against reason for systematic fraud, such as Fast and Furious and their porn policies, which they have systematically been found out time and time again to have been undermining their primary goal on the public arrangement in order to advance their uh, KKK white supremacy insurgent goals, which is the Hegelian dialectic, which actively accelerates the function in order to get the permission to do a thing. So, in order for in Project Northwoods, in order to get permission to fight the thing, they need to prove that the thing is a problem, which means they have to make the thing the problem. At which point they exponentially accelerate the black market, which they have control over, such as the cartels and others, which actively normalizes the function of all of their various criminal escapades as they engage in the arrangements to maximize their profits in the black market, such as, but is not limited to, prohibition. Many of the people in the CIA and FBI cornered the alcohol market after prohibition was ended, as they were engaged in the Fed's arrangements to create and maximize monopolies by the function of wizard communism for the white supremacy. At which point, the engagement of active denial and removal of evidence from court of their primary mechanism of engaging in these subversions is the protection of their criminal rackets and the progress of their non-congressional funding and the distribution of payments for status as an alternative to finances, which facilitates their ability to keep the payments the same financially, whereas if they're more important, they still need to be paid more. So they need to be paid more into an alternative status, which is actively promoted by their druid cult through the function of accelerated criminal access. And so the more important they are, the more things they're able to get away with, such as their abuses and blackmails, distribution, which is the false experiment position, which is the argument that they can engage in malicious abuses, such as in COINTELPRO, MK Ultra, and many of the others. All they have to do is mislabel the title in order to launder the victim into false justification to the abuse, and then they have access to the abuse by the fraudulent courts, which are actively blocked from the general public, so that they can consistently deliver the payment of the status demonstrated by the abuse. And thus, the higher status they are, the more abuse they commit. And thus, the more abuse they commit, the more abuse they have to commit in order to sustain their status. Otherwise, they would be demonstrated in the secret society function as being compromised, as they would not be consistently partaking in the various arrangements, such as their engagement when they are going undercover, such as with their pedophile raids for many undercover law enforcement who have to go and do that. They actively have to engage in the sex, and that arrangement normalizes the relationship with the targets, except the target is their own um, departments, at which point they have to standardize the function of their participation in these crimes in order to sustain themselves, as it has been reproduced not just for the compromising or infiltrating of actual material crimes and organizations, but the standardization of its implementation of itself, such as their protection rackets, such as when they were doing it with Jeffrey Epstein and many of the other arrangements, which they had actively covered for and defended. Um, it there, I think it was Charles Manson, I believe, the Helter Skelter, actively was making agreements with them, and his arrangement to create the murders from his followers under the cult of saving, I think it was saving the black community or something. This was completely arranged by the intelligence communities. They were actively protecting him as an asset. Whenever sheriffs or other law enforcement functions that were not connected to them overlapped into the function, then they were actively told that it's beyond their pay grade to do their job concerning this issue, as the function is slapped with a mislabel, which generates the protection for their various rackets, guaranteeing the normalization of the behavior, exponentially accelerating the black market. And you actively have these developments which have given them the position to posture their contempt for Congress, especially through the function of the FISA system and other abuses against American civilians, which they were not legally given authority to do, as the agreement has actively been challenged by many American judges, such as I think it was a judge in Utah. I'm not exactly sure specifically what his name is or his actual area, but a judge had to specifically tell the FBI to not plant child porn on people who are political targets, which they were caught doing by the judge, and then they promptly disregarded the orders of the judge, as they do not have any substantial loyalty to the United States. And these types of functions, under their false arguments of unitary executive theory and others, give them this era of contempt, which is internally justified, as their utter disregard from the orders, such as the heads of the NSA, who were actively protecting the unconstitutional use of surveillance functions, and specifically when challenged by whistleblowers trying to go through the proper revenues, were told that they don't care about the Constitution as the function of the breach of their oath, um, as their oath demands from them their loyalty and subordination to the Constitution. And this rejection is the demonstration that they have fully disconnected themselves from the American government under the nation of law. At which point you have the arrangement and normalization of the Confederacy, which is the creation and distribution by infection of KKK contracts for their arbitrary lawless functions in their phantom cells, which generates their general destabilizing of the general communities, such as their attacks against East Palestine, Maui, and many of the others, which have been targeted by these abuses in the war on David by the removal of the national security and the targeting of the patriarchy. They remove the security necessary in order to defend against it, so that when the attacks happen by their phantom cells, which they would deny by gross negligence, um, generates the injuries, then they get to launder all of the effects. They get to be paid for the prisons, they get to be paid for the tax dollars of covering the thing, doing the investigations, they get to be paid for promoting the political advancements. They get to be paid for the function of making many arrests for various charges and the such, uh, at all ends, including the black market trades where they are being paid to do the damages ahead of time. So when the criminal aspect of the thing to engage in the fraudulent false flag attacks with material damages, and then it still happens, at which point they actively promote it through the normalization of a variation of, I think it's called the Terror Factory, which is an aspect of the training from Hitler's youth, which generates the position where they actively encourage entrapment schemes, and many of the arrangements that have already been contracted to succeed as a terrorist attack that has to materialize, such as January 6th, then they would, by definition, have their distraction people actively protected before, during, and after, as this is an official arrangement for their damages against the American government and its obligations and interests. At which point, their subversion of the national interest by the terror factory means that they have, on the one end, the duds, which they present to the public as uh, things that they've quote unquote stopped or saved us from, and then there are the ones that they intentionally planned to go through, having cleaned their hands by using a proxy, which acts as a glove which keeps their fingerprints off of the arrangements, such as their distribution in the Fast and Furious case, where they were doing gun running in Mexico and others, which basically meant that they were just selling guns to cartels and they were pretending that they were going to track them, and then they didn't track them. And then, by definition, the mission was accomplished because they successfully sold it. And then, since they weren't actually tracking it, it's just, you know, horse shirt jerking around Congress and the others after it was revealed, as they lie directly to Congress in their various forms of contempt and disdain for the function of being subordinated to the civilian government. And many of the Confederate supremacists, uh, white supremacists, and other disloyal to the United States claim false distractions, such as their institutionalists, which engages in their defense arbitrarily against the violations, pretending some hogwash protection for them, which they functionally know is fraud, as the arrangement actively pursues the centrally understood damages as the criminal intention, which they protect from a remedy, and the right of the people to uh, seek a remedy from the government being actively blocked is a violation of the constitutional oath that those judges made, disqualifying them under bad faith, as they have actively conducted their subversion of their obligations and are disqualified from the right to be a judge, as they have been discovered to be a double agent by claiming that there is no remedy to a secret. As in the nation of law, which says that justice reigns, states by definition that they have to receive justice, and thus there must be a remedy to any offense, and thus the function of those in the Constitution who are primarily limited by the Constitution without a remedy to a secret would not have any, by definition, um, limitations. And if there is no in practice limitation on them, then by definition, the Constitution has been nullified and they are no longer functioning as an American government department. As this coup, which has materialized in the 80s but had been developed long before then, has demonstrated in the 1983 ruling against the constitutional rights defense of the existence of rights to anything that the person would want against hate crimes, by the military falsely claiming the function of a quote unquote experiment, at which point their arbitrary abuses, subsequently subverting and undermining that function, is actively support of known threats according to their own propaganda, as their own opposition to the function of communism was actively no such issue when promoting James Comey or John Brennan or any of the other known communists in function, which generates many of their arrangements of the prevention of the vetting system to have stopped it. Now, the function of them being promoted is less relevant than the function that the system existed to support them, as it was designed to stop their exact kind, and thus their exact kind having been found, were actively promoted as they have undermined by the infection the purpose of the thing that it exists in order to stop. And the removal of the core aspects of its definition is the complete subversion into fraud by the insurrectionist white supremacists by these arrangements, materializing the function of the threat against the general community in these arrangements as they are an arbitrary terrorist organization who practice the function and distribution of hate crimes, as that is their core definition, which is not protected by law. It is only defended by other double agents in the system. Then you have an insurrection by insurgent terrorists. And this insurrection by insurgent terrorists was actively promoted by William Barr and many other American hating supporters of the unitary executive theory, which states that there is no limitation on the executive by the judiciary and the legislature, which means there is no oath of office, which means there is no constitutional republic, which means there is no American government. Now, many of these arranged black markets have artificially been opposed by fraudulent justifications in order to advance the white supremacist communism, which generates their ability to corner the markets in their own particular monopolies, which generates their ability to reintroduce it into the market as they have won the arrangements by their violence and extortions as a mafioso type of arrangement or tactic of the economy, which demonstrates their natural inferiority in the market, as they, having failed in the market without violence, had to default into violence in order to sustain themselves, who, having no consideration for its endorsement, have seized the function. Many arrangements of these tactics have been conducted by the mafia in New York, such as their taking over of the garbage companies, which included the use of the threats of murder against the particulars, which in the double agents who have infiltrated the government's department have arranged includes the function of their ability to engage in false convictions and punishments, such as the director of Quest, who ignored the order from the FBI to engage in a fascist contract with them in order to have it be certified as a de facto government company controlled indirectly by the government officials into the function of only clearing it as a private industry in name, but in function a subordination to the white supremacists engaged in manifest destiny over these markets. And that threat and coercion and subversion and the arrangement of the public private partnership is the arrangement of fascism, which is an active problem which Joe has systematically defended and is undermining the function and integrity of the survival of the United States. At this point, you understand the foundation of the concept, which is that J. Sekulo's war is actually responsible for the existence of the thing that it pretends to fight under the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, under a false morality which hyperaccelerates their power, which in this case is engaged in these KKK contract terrorisms and harassments, which includes the distribution of higher status crimes for their distribution of child abuse as a resource to demonstrate the party's importance, which actively promotes the function of their militia, which generates their hate crimes against the general community for the entire definition of the hate crime definitions, including the terrorisms in order to stabilize the economy, including their child abuse in order to engage in political violence against their opponents in order to coerce compliance through voter fraud, and many other offenses of overthrowing the various republics, starting in California, which was overthrown in the 80s, according to the secret record, by the white supremacists, which actively engage in their terrorisms to make sure that the various policies are a complete and total failure, as the threats against the Democratic Party, um, in order to have them have opposition to David, has removed David's political party, which prevents the insurance and the economy stabilizing the function of all of the negotiated policies, maximizing their weaknesses as they engage in their hate crimes against the general public, protected by secrets which they would punish people if it was released in the function and normalization of criminalizing evidence, which protects the criminals from being subverted, normalizing the function of their KKK arrangements. At this engagement, any of the solutions that the Democrats would have made is actively undermined by the military operations of the unprofessional force of the Confederate insurrectionists. At this point, those who are complaining about the failure of the Democratic Party in California and others are actively referring to the publicly viewable aspect of the thing while ignoring the base reality of the hate group, undermining the possibility of its capabilities of having succeeded under legitimate conditions, as it is undermined by the militia from the hate group with government resources, and there is no functional way for the legislators to legislate around it, while the executive, presuming the authority of a king, can directly ignore the limitations set by the legislator and the judiciary, still loyal to the United States, and would actively throw out and vet any agents in the executive who are loyal to the Americans, who would use those functions under the American processes for the legislator and for the judiciary to do it correctly. At which point, if the executive agents who are loyal to America are going to be kicked out because of their competence and integrity and discipline and self respect, then by definition, you only have the white supremacist Confederacy and its various factions of its terrorist arrangements, normalizing these engagements at the advancements of each of the factions against all of the other ones in its contest in the collapse of the American government, such as the historic economic terrorisms that they've committed against the black community, which included their COINTELPRO program when they targeted the leaders of the black community, or many of the other offenses as they systematically engage in lawfare against them, undermining their ability to be capable of stabilizing and succeeding, and then actively retaliating against anyone who manages to pull success out of their rear end. Anyone who was able to magically succeed was actively subverted and harassed, which included the function of their breaking their treaties with the Indians, and their treaties arrangements having been broken are systematically ignored in favor of destroying them for the racism. And this engagement actively includes the function of putting a filter on payments to the Indians, guaranteeing that the resources that are sent to them are mismanaged, which generates the position of their snide objectives as insufferable racists. So if you have these historically arranged white supremacist communist arrangements, such as the old school Pinkertons and Union Busters, in order to reinforce the profits of the factories against the workers, then you by definition arrange for this predetermined series of answers, which has corralled the general public into the monopolies of the fascists and the communists, who were always a part of the system, and by definition, those parties who openly were capable of becoming fascists or communists inside the positions of power were only able to do so because the structures had already existed, and many of an old Soviet Union leader, I think it was Khrushchev, uh, I'm not sure though specifically, don't quote me on it, but he said that we will destroy the United States without firing a single shot. And by definition, they had been ceding their insurgents and influence for an exponential amount of time, um, before even the 1960s, at which point, when the Russians made their distractions uh, spies put in there, which the United States had already known about, um, whenever in the secret records for the War on David, the uh, the obvious ones uh, blew their cover in order to oppose their criminal abuses against David in this arrangement, which was promptly ignored by the Americans who were already knowing that they were Soviets, at which point the insurgents for the other ones, having already passed because of the distraction, it's like a magician. You have a magic trick where they're telling you to look in one hand while they're doing the trick in the other hand. The ones that the United States knew about were doing all of the things as an insurgency to keep the distraction as they knew who they were, and then the ones who were passing by had perfect cover because they were already looking at the wrong hand. And this arrangement has normalized the structure of replacing the United States with the insurgency by the normalization and standardization of the Confederates' insurgency, which had already existed and had already ingested them and was actively using them as affection against the Americans, which systematically undermining the arrangement engages in these Confederate insurrectionist policies and arrangements, which means by definition the Russians would not have to spend a single bullet to destroy the United States, as their infection guaranteed that the American corruption would collapse the United States through their white supremacists, which generates these various damages as a standard function of the inherent weakness of subverting the rule of law by these unitary executive theory functions, which is, by definition, how they planned to destroy the United States without the use of violence. The modern insanity of clown world actively promoted the means uh, in its various channels which have demonstrated it. Um, how you should look up Clown World and many of the other meme channels uh, has demonstrated the inherent insanity. The Libs of TikTok is a great one. If it's still up, I'm not sure. But, like, there are many demonstrations of them being obviously ridiculous. Now, they, through the corruption, had abused them to put them into the hyper-radical position of the insanity which generates these systematic collapses, as the system is no longer able to sustain itself under Lindsey Graham's war against the United States government, attacking David in the War on David in order to engage in the sedition, blocking the function of government capable of stabilizing the United States, as the sedition prevents the function of the government working correctly, which allows it to continue and exist and fix all of its problems. Its systematic ability to repent from failures and crimes and subversions and insurgencies, instead of defending them, is the only way to engage in recovery. And the engagement of the old age of a body is the inability to engage of refreshing each of the muscles with new nutrients and quality, as the old age blocks it from being as effective as it was previously, by the reduction of the other various effects such as hormones from the old age. At which point the inability to have managed it by the corruption being protected is the demonstration of old age for the United States, which engages in its decrepit state, which engages in the function of it collapsing, which is the former Soviet Union destroying their rival without firing a single bullet. Now, as this develops, their strength becomes their weakness, as people like James Cammey focus on Soviet-style tactics against law-abiding civilians in order to engage in these hostile ventures in the corruption and destruction of the American government, in undermining of the FBI, which has systematically arranged as a proof of validation of the theory that the infection started by the Russian theory had been completely successful. And these arrangements of not having a remedy to a secret is the infection by the Russians in order to destroy the United States, at which point the former USSR, having succeeded against its ancient rival, engages in the inability for it to have to engage in any violence against the United States. It just has to wait for the pathetic nature of its own inability to engage in competent management of its own systems by those virtue signalers who engaged in too much internal dialogue actively distract themselves in dereliction of duty, which manifests the materialization that they will completely fail at every level, as the status quo is a timed death march, at which point the suicide of the United States is a road to serfdom by the insurrectionist white supremacists who refuse to allow for any of the corrections essential to the United States and would rather destroy the entirety of the United States than allow the Americans to succeed in the United States, which would be the existence of the United States being allowed to exist as separated from the white supremacists. And the United States without the white supremacists is the only reason the United States would be able to survive at all by purging the insurrectionist infection. These plans also include the function of the creation of Revelation's Antichrist. And if we go to Revelation 12:17, it'll say, Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, and on those who kept the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. And I saw a beast rising out of the sea, with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns, and blasphemous names on its head. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard, its feet were like a bear, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And the dragon, gave his power and his throne and great authority. And one of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed beast. And they worshipped the dragon, for he had given authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like the beast? And who can fight against it? And the beast was given a mouth utterly haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. And it opened its mouth to utterly blasphemous against God, and blaspheming his name and dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. Also, it was allowed to make war with the saints and to conquer them, and authority was given it over every tribe and people and language and nation. And all who dwell on the earth will worship it, Everyone who was name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who was slain. And this is interesting on many accounts, including the function that if the head that received its great wound is merely the function of a nation, then you have the injury against the presumed nation requires, by definition, for it to have received a devastating blow to its existence, such as their attack on David in order to undermine and destroy his kingdom, which, upon restoration at the end of the Antichrist ritual, would be the resurrection of the head of that beast under their theory, which would demonstrate the position that the head, having healed a grievous wound, had been resurrected under these extraordinary circumstances, facilitating David's full restoration under their control, which manifests their ability to use the validation of the original projection of the contract schedule of the wealth owed to him in order to manifest it for their own frauds. And the endorsement of those injuries is the validation of the worship of Satan. Their criminal terrorisms and abuses, and ostracizations and censorships and obstructions were essential in the Antichrist ritual, as the existence of the Antichrist has to be a mystery until he's revealed. So, by definition, the obstruction of the victims wounding the head nation is essential to the function of that manifesting in base reality. They can't make that come to fruition without the abuses and the censorships. And so their abuses against David Bowles and many of the others who were supporting him in their arbitrary terrorist operations was fundamental in the creation and worship of their child sacrifice system, and the censorship and the ostracization and the harassments by these criminal subversions was fundamentally a cult sacrifice religious worship. And the religious radicals of the church nationalists, who, not being Christian, are falsely labeled Christian nationalists, have been corrupted by the Druid system seeking this creation, and validated by their terrorist threats, have actively reinforced these functions, at which point many of the churches have actively promoted the baseline structures for the manifestation of revelation in the support and worship of Satan, which their terrorisms have engaged in their arbitrary subcontracts for these white supremacist insurrectionist attacks, engages in the false representation of the Bible by its various misquotings, such as the kingdom of heaven is to be taken by violence, um, and the violent will seize it. This misrepresentation facilitates their terrorist moralization on the general public for the hate crime, which is the base foundation definition of the Mormon Satan, who is defined by his removal of free will of the general public of people in order to force them to be moral. And that manifestation of the Mormon Satan worshippers are using those types of quotes in order to propagate their uh, secret terrorist operations protected by the double agent courts through these systems, manufacturing the guaranteed end result of the insurrectionists desired by the Satanists. The common tactics of fraud often include the position of the CIA's position of conduct criminal intentions which seem too outlandish in order to be believed, and so the function normalization by the terrorist phantom cells would, by definition, be overly criminal in their operation and the maintenance of their status, at which point, anytime you accuse them of what they're guilty of, they get to pretend to be offended, and you have a bunch of mindless supporters loyal to the Druid religion, uh, which will always back them, which maintains the position of the reinforced noise, validating their criminal intention, and thus, even if it is eventually discovered, it comes at an expensive cost on fuel and energy and the rest of the essential functions in order to win in any particular direction. And on the other side, you'll have many strategies where they'll switch people. So if one of them is generally committing a particular strategy, which is subverting any legitimate exchange, it's pointed out, and then they switch the first party with the second party, or a third party, or a fourth party, or some other party who's doing a similar thing, who act at that point as cover for those acting in bad faith, and thus they act like you're being overly aggressive and in a bad situation, that you're misbehaving, when in fact the statement is completely perfectly accurate, pointed at somebody else, and it's actively being rearranged for the maelstrom. And the act of being too short in order to engage in the actual competent explanation to its entirety facilitates these false aggressions normal to the toxic femininity of the Nazis' war strategy from the Confederates in the Civil War, focusing on the sedition of the War on David in order to block the American functions. And these exchanges have consistently stacked criminal frauds as a false accusation gets a bunch of people rallied together off of that mess, and then when it's disproven, they go and recruit more people, saying that I couldn't get them on this thing, and I'm quote unquote confident he's guilty or confident she's guilty, which facilitates their accessory to the Fraz Ul Lul strategy of the D&D devil demon character, the demon lord, which generates the position of collecting people who are not of an evil alignment to be able to conduct evil things, as they are systematically entrapped by their willingness to subvert the rules and order in order to accomplish the mission off of inadequate information, at which points they have a constant flurry of over-enthusiastic, under-intelligent, low investigation support forces, which constantly allows them to stack frauds, at which point each and every time it's fraudulent, there are systematic abuses in the quote unquote enhanced interrogation, which is just torture, which engages in the position of censorship and obstruction so that they can replace the narratives. And anyone who can sustain themselves under torture would, by definition, be innocent. So, like, if you're in that situation, you're systematically just being abused for the sake of itself, as long as they have some nonsense distraction that they can pull out of their ass. At which point it stacks 8 times, and then they say to the next group that I've got all of this history and I've got this big docket of information and reports on them, as we've been following for an exponential period of time, at which point she will systematically have to be at the disadvantage, as the group having lots of reports specifically targeted at her or him, which would generate the position of the defamation to the general public having guilt by accusation by virtue of having so much information on them, it systematically engages in criminal subversion and undermining of the purpose of reasonable doubt by the general public who do not have the capacity to have dealt with it each stage at a time in order to determine the fraudulent inherent nature of those engaged in the criminal insurrectionist, white supremacist, terrorist operation in order to use lawfare for fraud. And the systematic position of the criminal surveillance is the undermining position of being able to plead the fifth, as these are illegal collections of information on parties, including planted information by virtue of having access to have surveilled them and thus controlled their general conditions at various degrees of investment into any of the strawman arguments for the simulation, as they're systematically removed from their legal rights in a conspiracy against their rights in order to create the fraudulent outcome which legally would determine them to be innocent. So by definition, they've replaced innocence with guilt. As the children of perdition, they have systematically pursued these militant strategies. Now, in the American legal system, those who have conducted themselves as agents of law without the service of law have disqualified themselves from the process, and anything that they've touched or tampered with is disqualified from the process, which is systematically concealed in contempt for court, which generates the fraudulent outcomes for their slave raids, manifesting the return to Confederate slavery and its arbitrary abuses against the general public in favor of the criminal nature of those who are seeking liberty from God. Maximizing specifically obstructed um, function, including the criminal violation of constitutional and superior law in general, facilitates the status quo function of the full diversity of their entirety, as they are fully disqualified from any legal procedure at every step in every perceivable way by virtue of these strategies obstructed from the courts under the false position of executive privilege for the right of kings, which is distributed for all of the other agents, which is validated in their strategy by fraudulently convincing the president to undermine his own authority and diversifying his powers to them, separating his authority from their authority so that he can maintain plausible deniability, and thus his authority can be undermined as they do not directly respond to him who cannot, by definition, validate or recognize their existence in relation to each other, similar to the militia forces who initiated the invasion of Crimea had to be disavowed by Putin during the invasion, at which point these tactics are quite ordinary, and the arrangement to their fulfillment has systematic fraud extorting for the criminal black market, which compounds the destabilizing of the United States, as the primary referred resource is crime or the injury to the general public. The exponential expansion of crime is the destabilizing of order, and thus uh, having overextended themselves on resources for cash, they've overextended their resources for taxes, they've overextended their resources for debt, and now they are engaging in the uh, overindulgence of the use of criminal profits. And these arrangements normalize their various extortions against the public, as it is weakened in their contempt for the United States public, who they despise for having been able to survive all of their historic injuries in their attempts to break the back of the American economy, which includes the protection of terrorism against the general public, for the statement that those who engage in these terrorist operations are protected by the devil agent courts disloyal to their office. at which point you have the various injuries to peoples, persons, and places in various conspiracies against rights, which is fully disqualified at every possible level, uh, which is only validated by the fraudulent support by the double agent insurgent terrorists who have awfully and unlawfully engaged in the insurrection and the dismantlement of the authority of their office as to make it the agent instead of being themselves a fulfiller of their oath of office, and thus their criminal injuries against the general public for various looting as an unprofessional militia has actively included the position of accelerating the profits for their white supremacist communism, uh, such as the records position for their destruction of Lahaina, Hawaii, or Maui, which engaged in the use of the intentional application of creating the fires and the entrapping of its civilians in order to guarantee that they die in the fires unless they systematically ignore the authorities who are misdirecting them so that they can suffer the injury, so that they can be looted for the advantages that they would not have been able to have acquired through a legal process, which by definition means they hold at major contempt of David's bulls for the character David, who would have saved them from these injuries if not by redeeming them by the insurance and its various protections, uh, may have stopped it outright if not obstructed, and thus the warrant of the war against David and the warrant against those protected by David would have, by definition, undermined David from being the general of intelligence oversight, allowing him to undermine the ability of them to engage in any of these terrorist operations for these looting crimes, at which point the exchanges for these murders requires the undermining of David by the terrorist subversion, uh, making them vulnerable enough to suffer the injury, which requires their holding David as the POW in the simulation, which they have been doing through the various obstructions of contracts in Sekulo's War on David for the complete overthrow of the American republics, claiming a fraudulent exchange of democracy as democracy of the elected by voter fraud, disloyal to the rule of law, engage in violations and excesses of the authorities of their office, such as the legislators who are elected under the concept would be considered the people, while they are, by definition, the people's representatives. And the people's representatives being in the authority from the chosen position of the civilian government, ignoring the legal limitations by law so that they can engage in infinite diversity and extortions for their advantage, have created a Soviet wizard council in the leveraging of extortions against the public, which includes the position of the KKK contracts for voter fraud, validating their false election systems, systematically removing their need for the Americans, while actively playing along in the exchange as they increase in money and power on the basis of the system working normally in the public eye while it is actively not working correctly behind closed doors as the extortions of their criminal escapades engages in the real election system by the KKK system. And those who are elected by the secret society's grand wizard become manifest into the office and thus actively defends the Confederacy against the rule of law and the nation of law and any enforcement, who, if they discover would support the Americans, would systematically be punished or removed from office, as that would be an inherent threat to their fraudulent power as the challenge to their legitimacy by base reality is the greatest threat to their fraudulent power. The trick of Balaam in order to deceive Israel into sinning against the Lord, removing his protection, is systematically the thing assumed how the Antichrist was given power in order to destroy the people. Thus, those who had the seal of God protecting them, preventing the knowledge of the Antichrist until he would be revealed, is based upon the Lord's waiting and obstructing evil from getting too bad until the time has been allotted. And thus, the assumption for many is that the rapture, removing Christians who are protected by the Lord, gives complete vulnerability to give the world completely to evil. And in this arrangement, you understand that only those who were of the hardened crime, and not just those who have taken the mark of the beast, would have been those who still remain there. And Revelation 9:18, a third of mankind was killed by the three plagues of fire, smoke, sulfur that came out of the mouth. The power of the horses was in the mouth and in the tail, for their tail like snakes, with which they inflicted injury. The rest of mankind who were not killed by these plagues still did not repent of the works of their hands. They did not stop worshipping demons and idols of gold, silver, bronze, stone, and wood, idols that cannot see or hear or walk. Nor did they repent of their murders, their magic arts, their sexual immorality, or their thefts. Then I saw in another mighty angel coming down from heaven. He was robed in a cloud, and a rainbow above his head, and his face was like the sun, and his legs were like fiery pillars. And those who rely upon the grace of God, who have renounced his function and renounced his power in favor of a hollowed out version, has taken the Lord's name in vain, and has at that point renounced the advantage. And in that arrangement, the things that the Lord would have loved becomes things that he hates. Like in Amos 5:21. I reject your festivals, nor do I delight in your solemn assemblies. At which point your assumption, because you have a church or some other meeting arrangement which actively validates the Lord with your lips but not with your heart, in your rejection of your ability to repent in favor of your extortions and their various advantages, by your contempts for your court and your defrauding of the government, you have in this position turned the glory of your worship into a contestable disease, rejected by God. I say again, Amos 6:8. The Lord God has sworn by himself, the Lord God of hosts has declared, I loathe the arrogance of Jacob, and detest his citadels. Therefore I will deliver up the city and all of its content. Matthew 5:23 and 24. So if you are offering your gifts at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Do not be ignorant of this. 1 Corinthians 6:10. Nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor revelers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. Do not go with those who are quick to shed innocent blood, and thus those who are engaged in these criminal subversions would inherently have to be condemned by any actual functioning Christian, if they go to church or not. It is against the definition of the product to agree to the violations of Sekulo's war and the other Confederate activities. Despite their false quotes of the Bible, they are leading in a deceit in order to entrap your very souls and condemn you to everlasting torment for the sake of their own advancement, including the delusion that their deals with the devils, who by definition would be prisoners in that arrangement, would give them a higher position in the hierarchy, and the maturity of developing your debts in favor of a better hierarchical position by the demons and devils, etc., would be irrelevant even if they did follow through on their word, as they themselves do not have any authority on how their captors will manage the arrangements, cleaning their crimes by fraud, such as holding people by their surveillance, undermining systems, uh, in a system of a bill of attainder without the use of an actual procedure owed, such as a quick and speedy trial, which would generate an actual series of answers as the investigation happens for the party who is being detained. There is no information that can be gleaned from the detained being detained, as they are not free to conduct an action. At which point, these positions are designed as a war of attrition in their obstruction of contracts and associations and other conspiracies against rights in order to manifest the criminal violation of the Constitution and its protection against any reduction of status without due process, or any of the other key essentials, which are the fundamental strategies of the sorceries and the swindlers and the frauds by the Confederate terrorist operations engaged in these crimes for the looting of their victims, which by definition would actively engage in the theft of properties. So, take for instance, if a party is being restrained and they obstruct payment from the person, the person cannot pay for the thing because of the procedure which is used in order to guarantee that the person runs out of their ability to have maintained the obligations because of the illegitimate restraints. And thus the default happens, and thus you have a punishment without due process, as their inability to pay is a direct reaction of the restraints. The restraints, as a war of attrition, deplete their ability to sustain their status and thus undermine the rule of law as a strategy of Confederate terrorism. These obstructions, including the censorship in order to protect and validate, actively rely on the criminalization of evidence in order to defend their position, as they do not want a remedy to a secret, which, again, will make America die of old age and the effects of old age, as the inability to repent is the inability to recover, rejuvenate, repair, reestablish, and stabilize, and thus, without the ability to repair, it will die of 1,000 cuts. And thus these delays in function facilitates something that would have been conducted in the obstruction as an accessory before the fact, which if you delay for a decade, for example, which has happened in the Warren David more than a little, would facilitate the ability to undermine the concept by these delays of having conducted the projections of anticipation, and thus the purpose of the obstruction is to stop the anticipation which is certified as the legal contract projection in order to stop the advantage of that contract from manifesting the security advantages or its other benefits as an extortion. And in that position, they acknowledge that the prediction would have happened and that it would have been successful, and thus undermine the position of it as a prediction and mislabel it under some other fraudulent distraction, manifesting their advantages and limiting the advantages of their victim. Thus, the advantage of conducting stingray technology against the general public, and thus the weaponized version of it in the military equipment, which is exponentially at a higher grade, which includes the use of um, terrorist violence to have an actual effect, such as the ability of them to have conducted the various experiments where their radiation attacks by the surveillance equipment and products was capable of controlling animals as well as being able to kill monkeys by targeting it at their brains, at which point the microwave functions and other connections which they would provide on these systems are capable of killing and committing serious criminal injury and harm by a um, low capability of being able to prove that the injury is happening as the terrorist harassment and criminal violence exponentially engages in the harassment. Thus, the use of these criminal injuries, uh, such as but is not limited to the ones quoted in the conspiracy film newly released, very good. Actually, I think it's pretty old, actually. But in that one, it covers many of the normal Nazi functions which were actively promoted, including the position of indirect eugenics by the use of these radio or X-ray technologies or others. They would be able to engage in the neutering by surveillance from these assault equipments in a deniable way, which engages in the inability to reproduce, which works for the genocide just as well, and thus it as a base actively being built on materializes the function of these types of technologies, which have been expanded exponentially in research by the military industrial educational complex for its various criminal advantages. As they seek these things as weapons of war, but those weapons of war being sold in the distribution of law enforcement without the service of law, engage in the terrorist operation of the KKK contracts for these arbitrary abuses with all of the protections of the government and all of the protections of civilians, creating a fascist coagulation which actively is used as a defense against the procedure of any lawful exchanges by the victims against the government, otherwise referred to, such as in the Bible, as sorcery. The systems of good faith require the investigation of the directly acknowledged violations and the reasonable suspicion of violations, which would be compounded exponentially in the barring of the criminal undermining of the rule of law, at which point these reasonable suspicions would lead into the uncensoring and declassifying and unconfusing uh, of all of the information, such as the FBI tactic of actively changing the title for where the information is held. I think there was one thing where it was they looked for something specific, and then the FBI denied it, and then they found the exact thing, and then they switched it to another category, forcing them to go through the entire thing again, and then they just kept on switching and switching it and switching it after each and every time the FBI was forced by a judge or something in order to release it. At which point, whenever that becomes incomplete in its strategies to maintain the contempt for court, then we would systematically be able to manifest the duel in the good faith and support of the Republic and Constitution, validating the actual material answers of the warrants to overthrow the government and the other essential pieces of information in order to come up with a final legal answer, including the obstruction of property, which, held by the government against the law, would have to be returned, and the processes of its various connections have to be restored systematically, as the criminal intent to obstruct the market for the communism is not something that can be validated by law, and thus must be condemned and corrected back into its original state, despite the expensive nature of the event.